Hi students, this is Dr. Spellman, and today we're going to look at our last section on informal fallacies. This is chapter 3.4 from the Hurley text. The last set of fallacies are fallacies of presumption, fallacies of ambiguity, and fallacies of illicit transference. So those 8 that you see there are going to be the last 8 that we're going to look at. So you'll remember from the last lectures that what an informal fallacy is error in reasoning, where someone endorses an argument that has false or weak premises. Again, it's not a formal fallacy where the structure is a problem. An informal fallacy is one where the structure of the argument is fine, or at least it could be. We could create an argument with a perfectly good structure, but it has a false or weak premise. Now we have 3 different kinds of fallacies today. Fallacies of presumption, and those fallacies are committed when the success of someone's argument depends on an unjustified assumption or presupposition. So there's some sort of assumption that the person is making that's false that leads them to draw the conclusion that they do. Fallacies of ambiguity, they depend on a shift in the meaning of an ambiguous word or phrase. And then finally, there are fallacies of illicit transference. What happens here is that the success of someone's argument depends on an unjustifiable attribution of some property of a whole to the parts of the thing, or vice versa, from the parts of the thing to the whole of the thing. So a fallacy of illicit transference says something like, because this whole object here has this property, is sitting on the table, therefore all of its atoms are sitting on the table, something along those lines. The first fallacy we're going to look at is begging the question. Begging the question involves using the conclusion of an argument as a premise in support of that conclusion. Now, why is it called begging the question, or sort of what exactly is this? So in any argument, whenever we're arguing for something, the premises of an argument are unsupported. So the thought is the conclusion is the thing that's supported, the premises are the things that are supporting that conclusion. So the premises themselves are unsupported. When we beg the question, the arguer is simply asking, that is begging, the listener to grant them the conclusion. So the premise, right, in support of the conclusion is just the same as the conclusion. And so when our conclusion ends up in a premise, it means that we're begging the question. So we beg the question when we ask our listener to grant us that conclusion, which is the conclusion is the answer to some question. So that's how the fallacy gets its name. We're essentially begging the listener to grant us our conclusion. Now, it's important to note that these days people often use the phrase begs the question to mean something like raises the question. But that's not the way that we're going to use it here. So even if an argument leads you to question something, that doesn't mean that the argument begs the question. So this phrase, begging the question, is a very sort of specific, has a specific meaning. It's a technical term. Here are some examples. Someone might say stealing is wrong, therefore stealing is wrong. And that's a really obvious case of begging the question, right? The premise is stealing is wrong, the conclusion is stealing is wrong. Obviously this argument begs the question. But we can make this less obvious. So if I said something like stealing is immoral, therefore stealing is wrong. Now, in a way, we could make this into a valid argument, like stealing is immoral, and if something's immoral, then it's wrong, therefore stealing's wrong. But that premise that if something's immoral, then it's wrong, there's nothing really interesting going on there, right? That's not an informative premise. Really, the claim that stealing is immoral just is the claim that stealing is wrong. They're saying the same thing. And so anyone who denies the conclusion that stealing is wrong is going to deny that premise. Now, again here, now I'm going to just give you a definition of stealing, right? And so as I make these changes, it's going to look a little bit less like begging the question, but it's still a kind of begging the question. So if I say intentionally taking someone else's property is immoral, therefore stealing is wrong, my premise is really just the conclusion, but I've sort of used a synonym for wrong. I've just defined stealing. So again, this is begging the question, even though the words aren't exactly the same, what the argument's doing is the same thing. Here's one final example. So intentionally taking someone else's property is immoral. It always causes psychological harm to those whose belongings have been stolen, and it diverts police officers' attention away from other more important matters. Therefore, stealing is wrong. Now, here, what I've done is I've given the same premise that I gave last time, but I've just added some other premises in, and then I've given the conclusion. But if one of my premises is equivalent to the conclusion, then even if I add in some other premises, that doesn't make it not begging the question. If I got rid of that first sentence altogether and said, stealing always causes psychological harm to those whose belongings have been stolen and diverts police officers' attention away from other more important matters, therefore stealing is wrong, that would be a good argument. But if this claim that intentional taking of someone else's property is immoral, therefore stealing is wrong, that argument is begging the question. So here's an example. The Cavs will win the NBA championship this year because they have a very talented team and because they're going to bring the NBA Finals trophy to Cleveland. So Cavs are not going to win the NBA championship this year. If there is an NBA champion this year, it seems like the NBA season might be done for. But the problem with this argument is that the first sort of statement, the Cavs will win the NBA championship this year, that is the conclusion. And then one of the premises is that they're very talented. But the other premise is that they're going to bring the NBA Finals trophy to Cleveland. That's what it means to win the championship. So there's nothing, that's just asserting the conclusion as a premise. So that's begging the question. Now, there's begging the question, and then there's complex question fallacy. And the complex question fallacy involves asking two or more questions within a single question, and then using the respondent's answer to the question to trap them. So something like this: have you stopped beating your wife? Question mark. The reason this is a complex question is because it has a presupposition that you beat your wife in the past. Now, regardless of whether you answer yes or no to this question, you can't help but admit to having beat your wife in the past. So there's in a way, there's this question like, did you beat your wife in the past? Are you beating her now? And you have to answer the question about what you're doing now. But whatever you say and answer that question is going to entail and answer the previous question that you were beating your wife in the past. Here's another example. Have you stopped neglecting your children? Yes? Then I guess you've neglected your children in the past. So they draw this conclusion from the answer. Have you stopped neglecting your children? No? Well, then I guess I should call Child Protective Services. So imagine someone says, have you stopped neglecting your children? And you think, well, I've never neglected my children in the first place. And you say no, right? Well, then it makes it sound like you were neglecting your children, and you still are. So seems like we should call Child Protective Services. The next fallacy we're going to look at is the false dichotomy. False dichotomy involves implying that the listener or reader must choose between one of two paths, when in fact they have other options. So false dichotomy says either this or this, when those aren't only two choices. So here's an example. Either you believe that God created everything in 7 days, in which case you're a young earth creationist, or you think that God played no role in creation, in which case you're an atheist. You're not a young earth creationist, so you must be an atheist. So there are other positions other than young earth creationism and atheism about how the world was created. So you can think either God did everything at once, you can think that God had no role, that there isn't a God, or you can think that like God had some role in creation. And so this argument's a false dichotomy because it ignores the possibility that you could have an intermediate view. Here's another one. We must start testing this new shampoo on mice. Who would you rather see live, a mouse or a child? So the thought is that we're testing shampoo on mice, but it's just shampoo, right? We don't need to kill anyone in this case. We don't need to kill mice in order to test the shampoo. We're not in danger of killing children. We know exactly how to create shampoos without killing mice or children, so let's just do that. That's an example of a false dichotomy. Now, there's this other thing called a false dilemma, and I'm not going to draw a big distinction between these two things. But a false dilemma is an argument where it's going to give you a conclusion about what you should do, not about what you should believe. So in this example, I say you should vote Republican unless you're a Marxist. You're no Marxist, so I'm sure you'll vote Republican. Here again, they're trying to get you to do something to vote Republican, and the distinction, the false dilemma is that like, well, you've got to either vote Republican or be a Marxist. Those are your choices. Here's another one. You'd have to be selfish not to donate to family relief, so I'm sure I can count on you for a donation. Here it's saying like either you're going to donate to family relief or you're selfish. And it's possible, right, that there's some intermediate there, that maybe you are poor, you don't have much money, so even though you're not going to donate to family relief, doesn't mean you're selfish. And finally, the last fallacy of presumption is the fallacy of suppressed evidence. And this involves ignoring some important piece of information that would significantly weaken your argument. One example here is from the vaccine debate. So in this argument, someone says, a 1998 study provides compelling evidence for the conclusion that vaccines cause autism. Given that, you shouldn't vaccinate your children. Now, what someone is suppressing here is the fact that that study was later revoked or retracted because it didn't live up to the appropriate sort of method that they're looking for a well-justified study. And so if you knew that there was that extra step, that retraction, but you didn't mention it, that would be suppressing evidence. Examples in the book often have this kind of feature. They sort of involve, there's some like sort of important change that has happened that's going to make something that held true in the past not hold true in the future. So this example says, for the past 20 years, cable subscriptions have increased. I'm sure they'll continue increasing for the next 20 years. Now the problem with this is, as we all know, that like cable subscriptions are likely to decrease over the next 20 years. And even if there had been no decrease up to this point, we can sort of see it, right? We can see that streaming services and things like that offer more flexibility and are more appealing. So even though these cable subscriptions have been going up in the past, there's no guarantee that they're going to go continue to increase going forward. In fact, it's unlikely that that's going to happen. Now, fallacies of ambiguity. So people commit a fallacy of ambiguity when the success of their argument depends on a shift in the meaning of an ambiguous word or phrase. Fallacy of equivocation, for example, involves using the meaning of a word or phrase at one point in one's argument and then using a different meaning of that same word at a later point in the argument. So I've included this image because the thought is it's ambiguous what it is. Is it two faces? Is it a vase? There's maybe, in some sense, no right answer to that question. And what happens in equivocation is the sort of arguer uses a term one way in one premise and a different way in the conclusion. You need quarters for laundry? Don't worry, you can get quarters at any bank. Therefore, you can get quarters over there by the river. Here the thought is like in the premise, it says you can get quarters at any bank as in a financial institution. And then the conclusion is about a riverbank, right? And so that argument's not good because it's equivocating on the word bank. Here's another one. Aspirin will make a headache go away, and noisy children are a real headache. Therefore, aspirin will make noisy children go away. And the equivocation is on this word headache, right? There's the thing that you experience in your head, and then there's like a headache in sort of colloquial terms means something like an annoyance or bother. So although aspirin might make your headache go away, it won't make bothers or nuisances go away. The other fallacy of ambiguity that we're going to look at is called an amphiboly. The fallacy of amphiboly involves misinterpreting an ambiguous statement and then drawing some conclusion based on that misinterpretation. So here we've got an example of something someone might say that could get misinterpreted. They might say, "Let's eat, Grandma." And that's different from saying, "Let's eat, Grandma." So the thought is, one statement is telling us to eat Grandma. Another thing is saying to Grandma, "Let's eat." And have this funny thought that punctuation saves lives. You know, if it wasn't for punctuation, we would draw this, we would make a mistake in reasoning and we would end up eating Grandma. Here's an example of an amphiboly. My dad told me that he shot a muskrat eating barbecue chicken. I guess muskrats are carnivorous. Here the thought is that his dad didn't shoot a muskrat that was eating barbecue chicken, but rather he was eating barbecue chicken while he shot the muskrat. And so this person draws a faulty conclusion based on a misinterpretation of what someone else has said. Here's sort of a famous news headline, and we're drawing a conclusion off of that. So you can't even trust paramedics these days. For example, today I read a newspaper headline that read, "Squad helps dog bite victim." Now, read in one way, right? Squad helps dog bite victim. That's perfectly reasonable, right? It's good that the emergency squad helps the dog bite victim. But if the squad is helping a dog bite a victim, that's not okay. And that's what the person infers here, that, oh, the squad must have been helping the dog to bite someone, and that's why they draw the problematic conclusion. Finally, fallacies of illicit transference are ones that are committed when the success of an argument depends on an unjustifiable attribution of the property of some whole to the parts of that thing, or vice versa, right? An attribution of the properties of parts to the whole. The fallacy of composition involves using the fact that something's parts have a certain feature as evidence for the conclusion that the whole of that thing has the feature. Note that this isn't always a fallacy. So if I said something like, every atom in the chalk has mass, therefore the chalk has mass, that wouldn't be a fallacy because it's true. Every atom in the chalk has mass, and that every atom in the thing has mass is going to guarantee that the thing itself has mass. It's also important to note that this fallacy can be confused with hasty generalization. Whereas the composition fallacy involves attributing a feature of a thing's parts to the whole of the thing, the hasty generalization fallacy involves attributing a feature of one thing to all similar things. So fallacy of hasty generalization would be something like, this piece of chalk is white, and this other piece of chalk is white, therefore all pieces of chalk are white. That's a different thing, right? It's using some instances of pieces of chalk to draw some conclusion about all pieces of chalk. Composition involves taking a part of a piece of chalk, right, and then attributing that to the whole chalk. So here's an example. Jalapenos, pickles, and vanilla ice cream all taste great. I bet we can make a lot of money selling vanilla ice cream with jalapenos and pickles in it. I use this example from Sweet Action ice cream because apparently they have ice cream that has jalapenos and pickles in the vanilla. That sounds horrible. I don't think that's a good idea. Now maybe it's good. If I was around Sweet Action, maybe I'd try it. But it just sounds like a bad idea. It's a bad argument thinking in this way. Here's another maybe more obvious example. So sodium is dangerous to humans, and chlorine is dangerous to humans. Therefore, sodium chloride is dangerous to humans. But while sodium is dangerous to humans and chlorine is dangerous to humans, we shouldn't eat either of those things. But if we put them together, you have sodium chloride, you have salt, and that's not dangerous to humans at all. So just because two things on their own are dangerous to humans doesn't guarantee that when combined, they're going to be dangerous to humans as well. Our last fallacy is the fallacy of division, just the opposite of the fallacy of composition. So the fallacy of division involves unjustifiably using the fact that something has a certain feature as evidence that that thing's parts also have the feature. Again, this isn't always a fallacy. So if we say, this chalk has mass, therefore every atom in it has mass, that argument wouldn't necessarily be fallacious. It's also worth noting that this fallacy can be confused with the accident fallacy, whereas the division fallacy involves attributing a feature of a thing to its parts. The accident fallacy involves attributing a feature that most things of a certain kind share to all of those things. Here's an example. You needn't worry about drinking that jug of chlorine earlier. If eating salt doesn't bother you, drinking chlorine won't. So here's what's going on is that they're sort of moving from the fact that salt is safe to eat to the conclusion that ingesting the elements of salt will be safe as well. As we know, ingesting the elements won't be safe. Chlorine is going to be deadly if you drink it, so don't do that. And then we could use the Sweet Action example the other way, right? So vanilla ice cream filled with jalapenos and pickles is disgusting. Do I want to try vanilla ice cream on its own? No way. I'm sure it's disgusting as well. Again, here we start out with the fact that these things in combination are bad. We can't infer that the parts on their own are going to be bad as well. All right, that's it for today. Go ahead and turn to your, the pages 174. I guess not in your books, right? Online or whatever. Take a look at page 174 and some of the practice problems there, and then check your answers when you're done. The more and more practice that you can do, the better off you're going to be. So can't practice enough. Have a good one.